robust period of work. His large, monumental indoor and outdoor sculptures were bought and placed around the world at many art centers, museums, colleges, and universities. While earning tenure at Muhlenberg, Sternal was awarded a Fulbright scholarship to teach and lecture in Seoul, Korea, and as an artist and lecturer in residence through the Royal Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Norway. In 1980, Sternal became the chairman of the art department at Winona State University in Winona, Minnesota, quickly earning tenure and continuing to create and place large outdoor sculpture pieces around the country. He left in 1984 to become the chairman of the art department at Morehead State in Morehead, Kentucky. His administrative responsibilities grew with the much larger department. Even as he continued creating art, he curated the university's Claypool Young Art Gallery, and eventually he founded the Kentucky Folk Arts Center as a means of providing much-needed support and visibility for underappreciated Appalachian folk artists. In 1996, Sternal relocated to Todd, North Carolina. After a brief stay at Appalachian State University, he founded the Elkland Art Center with his wife and collaborator, Martha Ensman. Together they became fixtures of the community, bringing energy and vision to the area. Their time together in Todd was a period of community engagement, encouraging and developing the artistic interests of local residents. He leaves behind a legacy of teaching and inspiring a love of art, having launched and shaped the careers of many artists. His own artistic vision was shaped by an eccentric and diverse mixture of art, from Harry Rotoya to George Nakashima to Frederick Remington, from the craft traditions of Norway, Korea, Appalachia, and from the natural environment. Yet his work was unfinished, energized to the very end, filled with ideas, visions, and curiosity. Tom Sternal is survived by his wife Martha Ensman, as well as his first wife Ann Sternal, his two children, Julie Sternal of Cambridge, Wisconsin, Tom Sternal, his son, and his wife Becky of Ghent, New York, three grandchildren, Tessa Sternal, Lynn Sternal, and Christoph Hughes, his sister Janice Sternal of Newport Richey, Florida, and his brother Stan and his brother Stan's wife Judy Sternal of Shoreview, Minnesota. Shoreview, Minnesota.
When we sent that obituary to the Watauga Democrat, she said, that's going to be awfully expensive. This is so hard. Thank you for coming. It's nice that spring feels like it's not so far away. My dad was a larger-than-life figure. For people who knew him well and those who didn't, he really was a singular character. I don't mean solitary, because he loved the company of people. In fact, he hated to be alone. But he was singular. He stood out. He represented his own ideas, his own views, some crazy, some incredibly advanced and ahead of the curve. But he definitely marched to the beat of his own drummer. As my wife Becky and my daughter Tessa and son Finn drove down here from upstate New York on Tuesday, which seems like an eternity ago, we listened to The Moth. It's on National Public Radio, and these are true stories told by sort of average people. And they have a tagline that they refrain that they like to say, that 5 of the most powerful words in the English language are based on a true story. And I think my dad's life was based on a true story. He loved to embellish. He would do almost anything to make you pay attention, as he liked to share those things. Coming down to Todd has been a special place. It wasn't really home. He moved here well after my sister and I had moved out and gotten on with our lives. But you welcomed him in. And what started out as a dark period became an incredibly happy period. He didn't always say it that way. He didn't always relate it that way. But this really was home for him as much as any place was. But what you experienced of him, I like to think of as Tom Sternal version 5.0. He changed in different places. He became somebody here that he wasn't necessarily before. And I was thinking about how when I was born in Arkansas and then we moved quickly to Allentown, and you heard the whole story, and we went to Minnesota, and then we came to Kentucky, and he ended up here. In each location, he had a studio. But the studios back then were very, very small. In Allentown, he didn't even have one. Then he had a bit of a garage. Then we moved to Minnesota, and he had maybe a 10 by 10 foot room in the basement. And then we moved to Moorhead, and he had his first sort of proper studio at home, and it was a sort of triangular, 2-level shape. And then when he came here, it just exploded. It just got bigger and bigger. But the irony of the whole thing is, as it got bigger, the work sort of got smaller. Not insignificant, but smaller. He went from making multi-ton, huge stone sculpture pieces that will last forever to bookmarks, spatulas. And that was okay. But I think what I want you to know is that I love that you remember him as, say, a woodworker or a craftsperson. But he was a significant and committed artist. And that life, and that sophistication, that cosmopolitan interest, really defined a big part of who he was. But like other curious characters, he could also relate to people of all different shapes, sizes, colors, backgrounds, anything. He was really colorblind, I think, in almost every respect. He felt more comfortable with people that were at least his size or bigger. So he loves, obviously, telling stories. And as I was thinking about what I wanted you to know about him, I thought I had to at least put in a couple of stories. And one was a story that I'll simply refer to as the dislocation. So we started moving when I was young. I was 1, and then I was 12, and then I was 15, and then so on. But we were living in Minnesota, and I had finally made friends. The acne had started to clear up. The braces were gone. And he said, we're moving. This was only 6 months or so after my grandfather died, maybe a year. It was a bad time to move. And I was really angry. My sister was gone. She was already gone off to Davidson. And he came to me, and he had been sort of pouting and protesting silently. And he said, if you tell me that you don't want to move, we won't move. And I swear before the word move ended, I said, I do not. I will not ever want to move. And he was shocked, because I rarely spoke back to him. I rarely spoke up, because he was an intimidating figure, especially back then. But I was resolute. I did not want to move. So we walked away silently, stunned, and I could tell perturbed. I can't remember if it was later that day or maybe the next day, and he said to me, what if I bought you a stereo? I thought about it, and I said, okay. So $300 Pioneer stereo, turntable, cassette, no CD. We packed up and we moved to Moorhead, Kentucky, which was extremely hard. But then years later, in fact, I think just about a year ago, I overheard him talking to Becky, my wife, I think. And he said, that move to Moorhead saved Tom. If we had stayed in Winona, he might have been a business major. I had to thread the needle with him, because when I told him that I was thinking about going back to get a master's in fine art and photography in the early 1990s, he would not hear of it. And I took it personally. Maybe he thought I didn't really have the talent or the ambition or the drive to do it. But what he later said is he didn't want me to struggle the way that he had struggled. So I had to find a career that had a degree of creativity, but that I knew, and he knew, that it would support a family. here and say he was flawless, he was perfect in any way. Nobody would believe it, and it's not, no one is. And I can't remember if it was my dad, because he imparted so many words of wisdom, like, wherever you go, buy a newspaper. It's the cheapest entertainment you'll ever get. And I still do it. But he was filled with contradictions, these dualities that you had to somehow reconcile, right? He was both incredibly helpful, and he was incredibly helpless. Yeah. And I remember we would sometimes go skeet shooting or trap shooting, and if any of you, we only had to see it on the Love Boat off the promenade deck to know that when you want the clay pigeon thrown, you say pull. And we'd gone to this very fancy gun club up by me, and it was his turn, and he said, "You're going to have to call pull. I can't do it." This was like 15 years ago. I mean, it was absurd. But still, he had that level of dependence and reliance. So helpful and helpless. He was Norwegian, but he really wasn't that Norwegian. At most, like an 8. He was as much Polish or German, and you would never know it. He was incredibly generous, and he was incredibly shrewd. I remember when, again, he bought me this fishing rod. It was this beautiful antique fishing rod. It had these agate, what do you call it, ions or eyelets, or where the line would go through. And he gave it to me. It had a hand-carved wooden handle. The next day it was gone. And he said, "Oh, I traded that. I literally had it for 24 hours. He was also this big, commanding, physical presence. He would brag about how strong he was. We'd have arm wrestling competitions back when we were kids with all the art majors at Muhlenberg. His best event, though, was leg wrestling, because he had these very short legs, and that he could always win. But he was incredibly allergic to exercise. Here he was, this powerfully strong, confident, commanding presence, and I think in the 46 years that I knew him, I saw him exercise precisely once, and that was about a 2-block run in Allentown, Pennsylvania. But all of these contradictions, I think, were a way that he was somehow seeking validation. He had a father who really withheld affection and really any kind of support for him throughout his whole life. I think he visited us once in our whole life. And to a certain extent, I think my dad was always trying to get the validation of people because he didn't feel it really ever from his father. His mother was very involved, to a degree, I guess. But she herself had moments and lapses where she couldn't really kind of provide him the support and the love that he really wanted. So I think he went searching for it. He was looking for it all the time. And so these contradictions, I think, emerged because what we have, I think, to recognize is he, for us, some of us, is a grandfather. For others, he was a father. He was a spouse, a husband. But just as importantly, he was a son, he was a grandson, he was a great-grandson, and the pain that he felt throughout his life was something that he carried with him always. And you could have both roles. You could be a grown man, and you could be a very afraid little boy. And I think he was both of those things. It's what made him vulnerable, it's what made him loving, it's what made him approachable. And in some ways it made him perfect. Because I think perfection can only be achieved when there's some kind of imperfection as part of this. If everything is flawless, there's something not quite right about that. A cubic zirconium is not the same as a diamond. I wanted to think of, there were so many stories that as I was sitting, and this was kind of writing itself in me for literally decades, these remarks. There was a story that's maybe about 5 or 6 years old, and I don't think many people have shared it with, but he had just had the heart valve replacement, right? And he had been in pain, and he was suffering, and he was by and large miserable. And I remember talking to him on the phone with a fair degree of regularity, and he'd say to me, "I just want to get well, and I just want to